I just want to pick up from there, actually, and ask you to speak a little bit about talk a little bit about the difference between visual rhetoric for fiction versus nonfiction, and the experience versus understanding, and how you might approach those goals differently.
Gives me time to write.
Nonfiction here.
Nonfiction as well.
Although maybe it relates to my comment about expertise, right? And that the more expert we are, fiction versus nonfiction. I guess in teaching, the only thing I can think to say about that is that it maybe is also a reflection back to the days when a medical student worked with a cadaver versus work with an abstraction of a cadaver, some representation of a cadaver, is most teaching is an attempt to re-encapsulate the real world in a made-up world, which makes teaching a kind of a fiction, right? But I forget who I heard say this the other day. Fiction is also true. Actually, I think it was Amy Mann talking about her songwriting. She said, my songs are not autobiographical, but that doesn't make them not true, right? It's a fiction about a truth. And I think that, to me, that resonated with how I think about trying to get my students to understand something in my instruction, is I'm trying to construct this world. And so I should be thinking about how to use visuals in that narrative, and I do, but I think I too am trying to learn. I'm back to my idea that most of us weren't taught how to teach. Much less are we taught how to teach and communicate visually in most fields. So I was thinking about earlier in the day, the way a scientist might understand a formula is the worst possible way to communicate it to somebody who doesn't understand that whole world, right? But so what we need to do is figure out and understand these other ways to get the ideas across. And I don't think we're that good. I know I'm not that good at it.
All visual people here. Just write something down.
Should I say something?
I was one of the spots that you guys
Oh,
said.
yeah,
That was
okay.
your time to think while I was
So,
damping, yes.
so the question is about the rhetoric of fiction and nonfiction, like visualization somehow? The visual rhetoric. I mean, one thing first I want to grab from the previous conversation that I agree with many ideas I heard that I kind of try to instill in my students. I usually don't walk into the classroom with theory to stuff in their minds, because one benefit of having a studio-based teaching is that you can sit next to them and instill those ideas through conversation without using the vocabulary. But I do believe that even though the learning experience stops when you have the vocabulary, it's important to talk about that, because when it's not the conversation, it's more like you tell me what you see here, it's very hard for them to and it's also, I have the impression, and I'm assessing this idea, if this vocabulary is what it helps, creating this schema in their minds, because I always talk about deconstructing the phenomenon and then find the visual representation for each part. So based on that, I always tell them that what they create is a form of argument. It's a visual argument. And it doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction, it somehow shapes reality. And it's in that way, I'm trying to move them away from, it's about the beauty of the shapes, or the beauty of the colors, or how much information you stuff in. It's more about in other words, you can call it storytelling. But when I try to say it's a visual argument, is that you create that visual for a reason, so you expect it to have some impact in a certain way. It may happen, it may not, but you're going to affect the environment as soon as you deliver it. So I haven't explored fiction, but I would take a similar consideration in the sense that if I have a graphic novel and then that novel shapes my understanding of reality when I try to reflect my own life with the things I learn and see from the pages, I can see how the novel is an argument, It's reshaping the way I see my own life. Maybe that happens if I read Phoebe's novel, right? I think differently about a certain issue after reading it because the novel was an argument itself. And I can see something similar with information visualization and data visualization, or any form of visual rhetoric, I guess.
Yeah. Well, okay, the difference between fiction and nonfiction. I think if you're talking about in comics, or you, sorry, I was thinking in my head and the question. Were you talking about in comics in particular, or
No.
just in general?
In general.
Okay. I think that all storytelling, including, for example, a surgical illustration where you have 9 different steps and they're all numbered and maybe there's captions, but you're explaining how to do something. So compare that to something telling us what Bitcoin is, right? A comic explaining what Bitcoin is, like Scott did. Or then you have a fantasy story, a comic as well. I'm just thinking of comics. Really, they've got so much in common. When you tell any story, fact or fiction, it is all fiction in a sense, and it is all fact. Even fantasy refers somehow to what we call reality, because if it didn't, there would be no contrast. So, and we wouldn't even recognize it as fantasy. And anything we describe as fact, like, for example, a surgery, we're looking at it. We're not showing the whole surgery. We're not showing all the details. In fact, economy of detail is very important, so you're not distracting the viewer. You can't draw every damn blood vessel or all the blood that floods in when you first make the incision. You can't do all that. It's not relevant. You just want to show those vessels that are being reattached, what tools you're using. So you're making so many choices, and most of them are to exclusion of everything else. Right. And the same goes when you're crafting a story of any sort, true or false, because narrative structure is something, we all know what it is. Tell me a story, Mom. You know, it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, very simply, generally. I'm sure that there's plenty of authors that have tried to go against that, but generally that's what we're expecting. And life isn't quite like that. I mean, did we really begin when the sperm met the egg? No, probably not. We began long before that, when those eggs and sperm were being formed. And before that, you know, it just goes on. It's a continuum. After we die, it's the same deal. So we impose this narrative structure on the stories we tell. And in that sense, we are fictionalizing, because it's all our own choice. It's all artifice, whether we're talking about Bitcoin or, you know, Godzilla. And
Both Japanese, interesting.
exactly, yeah. And I was just laughing because you said Amy Mann, she said she might not write songs that are autobiographical, but they're true. And I was just thinking, I might create autobiographical stories, but that doesn't mean they're true. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Wow. So I agree with all three of you, and there seems to be an emerging theme here of artifice and its role with respect to reality in teaching. And I think that students often, or early on, don't know the difference, and they think that what you're presenting in visual images is reality, is truth, and they haven't yet graduated to understand that it's a schema or a representation or an extraction or a fiction about the real phenomenon. So they stop, and maybe that's related to your labeling issue. They might stop there with the label and not move into what the real phenomenon is and the glory and wonder of that. So, I guess we're all fiction makers.
I think so.
I'm not sure that would go in a promotion document, but it might in fact be what we do.
We're all liars would be more economical.
Right, yeah.
Well, picking up on that thread, I I think that I said this when I was in my book when I'm talking about maps, but it's true of really all visualizations, that all visualizations are judgments. And all of them are that saliency map of like what matters and what doesn't. And, when Phoebe is talking about the fact that you can't draw every blood vessel, I think that the thing that it's so easy to forget is what a massive collection of details are being left out. That in fact, any sort of visualization is only visualizing a tiny fraction of what's there in the world, and it is distorting it. And some distortions, some lies, if you will, are beneficial. One of the most famous examples being the London Tube map, which does not slavishly mimic the geography of the lines themselves, but instead visualizes the procedure of going from one stop to the next and creates something a lot more elegant. That map is almost 100 years old, and yet it seems as new as yesterday because of that. Going back to medical visualization, actually, I remembered another thing I was going to say. This is so awesome. This is both of you touched on this, actually. Visualization of something in 3D space. We're saying one of the only ways to truly understand the structure of the body is to get your hands in there, in some respects. I think in some respects, the idea of taking something that exists in 3D space that's profoundly 3D. Like I have never found a two-dimensional diagram of the anatomy of the eye that's anything more than nonsensical. It's a crazy thing to try to flatten it out, to do a cross-section. A cross-section of the iris looks like that. That is not the iris. Does that look like an iris to you? That's nuts. That's like trying to show the Upper Peninsula from Pluto. It makes no sense.
It depends what magnification.
Well, even at a high magnification, it's,
there's
it's a
plenty
ring.
of detail.
You're not
Right,
getting
yeah.
the ring. It's just like, I hate it. But the funny thing is, now you had mentioned that, well, it's economical to show 3D visualizations. A slowly rotating 3D visualization, I have a couple. I have one in my pocket right now. I'm pointing to my wallet. I mean my phone. I can't tell left from right. But when I'm trying to study the anatomy of the brain, thank God for a rotating 3D visualization, because something like the limbic system, I don't care what angle you choose, it's going to be wrong in flatland. One single flat view of it is always going to be crazy and nonsensical and wrong until the thing is rotating. It just doesn't feel right. And I'm thinking, just looking at this, I think that diagrams of things that are profoundly 3D, I think that was a 500-year digression from the truth. Put your hands in the body, you'll understand, but that isn't always practical. We were waiting for 500 years of bad visualizations until we could just turn the bloody thing.